Good morning, everyone. I want to say welcome to our audience, especially you intrepid folks out on the West Coast who may be joining us, and welcome to all of our panelists this morning. You are watching tomorrow's Queer Communities Today. And I'm just going to read the panel description. Queer communities have popped up in SFF stories from Tom Reamy's San Diego Lightfoot Sue to A.M. Dellamonica's The Cage. But they're still uncommon even in tales of the far future. One reason may be that queer people are still figuring out what queer community looks like in the present, with the internet making virtual communities possible, while old-school gay bars and bookstores struggle to stay in business. How can speculative fiction support the evolution of queer community by imagining new shapes it might take, and also support readers who are desperate to see not only themselves, but their friends and found family in SFF? So I'd like to start with panel introductions. And since in Zoom, it's kind of hard to go down the line on the table, we'll kind of do this on a roll call basis. So I'll just call on you one by one. So panel introduction, who you are, why did you choose to be on this panel? And I struggled to find a way to put this question in, and I thought the best way to put it was at the start. We can go back to it. How have you presented the idea of queer community in your own work? If you have something you want to say about that. So let's just start with Chip, Samuel Delaney, because you're at the top of my screen.
Okay. Well, I never thought of myself as living in a queer community at any time in my life. I made physical moves to areas of New York that I thought were more, queer friendly. Certainly, that the very first one I did is I moved from where I was living in the north part of the city, where around the Columbia University area, to the Lower East Side, which was right next door to Greenwich Village, which I presumed was going to be a more, as I thought of it at that particular time, a gay-friendly area. And it was also a friendly area that was more friendly to the arts, and all sorts of things like that all went along to it. But it was sort of and it was also cheaper. For a while, I lived in what was known in Philadelphia as the Gayborhood, although why? Because I inherited the apartment I was living in from an English teacher who had a wonderful little pied-à-terre on Spruce Street. And now I'm not living in any place like that. And nor have I met any gay people or queer people, particularly in the area that I'm living now, although it's known as the Museum District in Fairmount. I've played around once with Scruff just to see whether it did anything. And I had to walk very, very far and had a really strange experience, very pleasant, but not one I wanted to repeat. So that's been my experience with this in life, in 2 or 3 sentences. I did once in a book, envision such a community. This is the book. Some of you may know it, Through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders, in which I actually envisioned a place that had been set up by a Black gay millionaire down on the Georgia coast, that was set up specifically to be a community for Black gay men. He had houses built and things like that. And it survived for a while. And then a lesbian community started on an island not too far away from it. And so there was a lot of interchange back and forth between that. But the community itself was, was different. And the story was, went back and forth. Um, so I don't, so that's about the closest I've done to dealing with it in an actual book. Which is still, which is interesting. When it was originally published, it was my book that it's one of my longest books. And it was only published in about 3,000 copies by a small publishing company called Magnus Book. And then eventually I had to republish it myself. This is my own self-published version. As I said, so I can just show it to you. And it's available on the Great Evil A. That everybody feels very differently about because it is so big. And then there's another also, I wouldn't call it a book from earlier that's also self-published, which may be relevant because it's about a couple about a guy who moves from a place to a place like that and it's not science fiction at all. This is called Shout Rumblin', His Sensations and Ideas, which is a smaller book and it's an earlier book. And it's about someone who moves from different places around in the country because the queer community has always been scattered around. It doesn't tend to, other than in a particular city, there may be a neighborhood which for a while is assumed to be, more gay friendly than not. But whenever that happens, invariably other forces come in to break it up. Because for the same reasons that gay people want to live there at one point, usually other people decide, hey, that doesn't sound so bad for us too. And so, for instance, there is nothing gay about the neighborhood anymore. And I basically was forced out by economics, which is why I'm in the museum district now. So and this all of this takes a while to be reflected in the book. So that's my introduction to what I've done with it, and we can go on to more detailed questions later on, and I'll let other people have a chance to talk. Okay?
We will be able to. We've got several questions that will kind of circle around to what you've talked about. So Sachi.
Hey, my sense of community for about the last 20 years has been more of community of lesbian writers and readers. I've edited about 17 anthologies and a couple of collections. And I've found that over the years, even in my area, which is near Northampton, Massachusetts, which used to be called Lesbian Town, the things have changed. Fewer people actually identify as lesbians. Those who do are settled down in families and raising kids and that sort of thing. But so many of the writers I've had have moved on, become trans, non-binary, and they're excellent. But what I really felt the community best was when I would have readings out here and in New York of with contributors to my anthologies, and so many that I had locally don't do that anymore. They don't consider themselves lesbian. They're not writing lesbian erotica. They're not writing anything right now. I would go well over a dozen times to New York to do readings at the bookstore Blue Stockings, which at the time was a community, felt like a community. The last year or so, they're probably the only feminist bookstore left in New York. and they are edging much more toward an emphasis on political activism across the spectrum, not particularly focused on queer community. However, I haven't been able to get there with the pandemic and not having any recent things like that. But I'm still connected to my writers. That's what even on Facebook I'm in about 24 groups, but I only pay attention to the ones that have a kind of a camaraderie. And this is a replacement, as has been mentioned in the description of this. It's been one replacement for community, and I find it is an excellent kind of community, even though we don't get the face-to-face and flesh-to-flesh going. We have the added bar-like camaraderie conversations, but we can enhance them with photos and GIFs and emojis, and we can actually be in contact with people from all over the world. We're not relying on just the locals. That has actually pleased me a good deal, and I don't know a great deal about what's going on in groups that do not involve readers and writers, but I find the ones that do are what interests me. As I said, many of my friends from earlier days have just moved on. They've become trans. They've gone elsewhere. The sense of my sense of community has switched more to the to online, actually. But as far as producing works about community, some of my writers have actually gone into that fairly well. They've placed stories in bookstores and in other communal kind of things, and we've also started edging into the writing about older people, not as old as I am perhaps, but what's happening with the older people, and some sort of some amount of community on those lines. I did some research for this, but I brought all this stuff down. But one of the things that I noticed that isn't affecting me, but that in New York and a number of other places now, there is a movement toward establishing retirement places for queer people, for lesbians in particular. That's what I was noticing. SAGE, SAGE, is a big organization now in New York that does all kinds of things for the queer population. So I've been watching that. But as far as the the people I used to know and used to be with, they're moving on. They're not writing anymore. They're gone. They're going other places. But the favorable thing that I don't partake in, but I'm watching now, is my alma mater of Mount Holyoke College, Women's College, now accepts trans men as students there, and they're the organization for gay students. They're Lion's Pride, because of being Mount Holyoke being founded by what's your first name? Okay, I am getting too old. Lion is trying to keep the community going with the younger people, but the younger people aren't as interested now. In fact, that most of them are into political activism of one kind or another. It's just a different kind of community. I approve of it. I contribute to it, but things have changed. I don't feel a sense of community except in the online reading and writing community, you might say. That is really huge. Too many people are writing. We know that. Too many people are writing. But I enjoy it. I enjoy giving advice, and I'm finding my community there. In my own work, as I say, I've edited the anthologies. I've also written a great deal, but when I was writing that stuff, I was not thinking of community, except in terms of my other writers. And I was not thinking in terms of bar and well, bookstore, yes, bookstore. We had bookstores here. We did writings at bookstores here. The bookstores are gone now. And in New York, the bars and bookstores are gone. There's still Blue Stockings, but as I said, they don't feel the same. And I looked up some of these facts, and apparently there are only 2 lesbian bars left in New York right now. Cubbyhole and Henrietta Hudson. And I've had some experience of Henrietta Hudson, but the younger people are just doing other things. They may have communities. They do have communities, but they're just not the same thing. And I haven't. I'm nostalgic, but I don't actually feel plugged in, except as I say, to my online people who in fact are older than most these days. But we for a while we were worrying that there wouldn't be any more butch lesbians because they were all transitioning, and in fact that has happened to a good deal of my friends, and it's great for them. But for community, it whittles the community down. And I'm feeling now that I would like to do more writing and editing perhaps on the subject of communities and possibilities of communities in the future, but that's all I've got for now.
Okay, so Kathy.
Oh, hi. Okay, so I wanted to be on this panel because I have a lot of thoughts. One of the things, a very quick thing that I'm just going to throw out there is that when I saw this panel description, it was in the middle of the great, every year we have to have the giant "should kink be allowed at Pride" argument. And so I was watching that and just being like, usually when I see fiction, with, of course, Chip's book being very an exception to this, but usually when I see fiction about queer communities in the future, they're not very kinky, or they tend to be more, at least in the fiction I've been reading, sedate and sort of assimilated. And so I thought that was an interesting thing that I was seeing in the fiction versus, should we even be allowed to have, kinky things happening at Pride? But anyway, in terms of my experience with queer communities, it's kind of interesting because I'm coming at the opposite end, I think, of a lot of the older queer people when it comes to communities, because I feel like in a lot of cases, the queer communities, especially in physical spaces, have, for the most part, already been gone by the time I show up. So I lived on Capitol Hill in Seattle for a couple years, and I'm not going to say it wasn't queer and that there weren't still some gay bars and stuff, but it mostly felt extremely gentrified rather than queer. And I mean, this is not even just a queer thing. This is a gentrification in cities thing, especially in Seattle with Amazon and Microsoft, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on for years listing the companies there. And so the biggest problem I had was, number one, it was too expensive for me to really live there. Number two, it was too expensive for anyone else to really live there. And most of the people that I saw when I was on the street or that I was talking to when I met them were fairly straight. And I didn't really get a sense of that community. So I've always had sort of if I want a queer community, I kind of have to build it myself perspective. And so some of that is showing up to physical places and the community not being there. Some of it is also that being a trans man who, unlike the stereotype, I actually never went through a lesbian phase because I've always been into other dudes. So, but as a trans man who initially tried to come out in undergrad about 15 years ago, I've also had the experience of showing up at queer communities and finding out that they were very specifically gay and lesbian spaces, or a very specific kind of gay space that I wasn't particularly welcome in. And some of that is that I don't pick up on, I don't always pick up on like sexual overtones and undertones in communication. So like I'll show up to things that are like really obviously, once I get there, intended to be hookups. And like, I'm not actually interested in that. And none of the people there are interested in me. My husband and I actually went, because I'm living on Long Island right now, and I was like, let's see what's on Fire Island. And so we took the boat over to Fire Island, and I have no, like, Fire Island looks very beautiful and it's very nice, but it is very much not for fat, unattractive trans men. We showed up and I was like, oh my God, I've never felt this out of place in any place I've ever been, because it was all extremely beautiful cis gay men having a great time. And I was like, I feel like such a tourist right now. Like, it was so awkward. But besides feeling out of place that way, I've also had situations where, like when I went to the LGBTQ group on campus in undergrad, I went to ask them, I was like, so do you have any trans resources at all? And I ended up talking to a lesbian who just seemed very unhappy that I like was bothering to show up. So I just never went back. So it's kind of this like, many of the traditional physical queer spaces I've found have either been gone due to gentrification or people moving on, or I've found that they have been a specific type of queer space that isn't intended for me, or that doesn't feel particularly friendly to me. And I mean, in the case of Fire Island, like, it wasn't like anyone said or did anything that was in any way rude. Like, everyone was very nice. It was just, I felt like, wow, I feel very out of place right now. So that's like my big rambly intro, I guess, to my thoughts about queer community. And it's just that I feel like what I've been told queer community is doesn't tend to exist anymore, or hasn't really been for me. So I've mostly made my own queer spaces online. And that also is probably an age thing, because I started hanging out on IRC almost exclusively when I was 16. So I am the beginning of the completely online generation, I guess. So.
Okay, Meg.
Good morning from the Bay Area, where it's very early and still very queer. I moved to the Bay Area as soon as I could. I'm making this in, by the way, because when I was 18 or 19, I got a hold of a copy of The Fifth Sacred Thing, where it's 2068 in the Bay Area, except it's also 1968 in the Bay Area, and everybody in that book was queer and poly, and screwing up the heteropatriarchy running the country. Sorry, I don't know if we're swearing or not. Anyway, all I wanted was the life in that book, and I thought that it existed here. And I put everything I had toward arriving here. And like Kathy, I arrived to find that the spaces that I had been told in a legendary sense don't exist anymore. And moreover, that to be a queer person here in the Bay Area, one takes a vow of poverty, whether one wants to or not. It is very difficult to live here. It is punishingly expensive. Young queers, please don't. I have in my own work sought to rediscover queers in spaces in science fiction where I find that they tend to evaporate. My first series is a post-apocalypse, and I kind of wiped out the genre looking for examples of stories where queer people didn't cease to exist when everybody was very focused on we must continue to species. And newsflash, queer people don't cease to exist, and that I think make things more interesting. So with a couple of notable exceptions, Octavia Butler and Margaret Atwood notwithstanding, I wanted to write more queers into the end of the world, because I live here and I haven't seen a straight person in 3 weeks. So I can't imagine a world without us. And that's all I got.
Okay. One of the things that, this being Readercon, this panel wanted to look at is not simply queer community in and of itself, but also how it relates to spec fic, how spec fic can model the future, how we can look at the good and the bad, both in the sense of cautionary visions of what we don't want to see happen and positive visions of what would work better. And I know we've already covered quite a bit in terms of what we mean by queer community and the shift from physical communities, which, for example, I read the story The Cage. Prepping for this panel, I had not read it before, and I noticed that the community that's presented in that story is multi-leveled. It is both a very social community in the sense that they are all friends. It's somewhat intersectional in that there is a disabled gay person as part of that community, and yet it's geographical because they're described as all living in the same neighborhood. And so we all tend to think of these neighborhoods, these enclaves where people of similar affinities will cluster and they'll choose to live together. But such enclaves can also become, they can become traps in a way, because people get used to, the mainstream people get used to them living in that area, and they're not as welcome when they move out of it. But in the interest of keeping this sort of free flowing, I know we do have some very interesting panelist questions. And one of them was, how do we see the evolution of how we represent ourselves as queer people? How we represent ourselves mirrored in fiction of the future, you know? And I want to look at not just the dystopian kind of fiction, which tends to be more common, is that, you know, queer people as outcasts, queer people as aligning themselves against a harsh world, and, you know, even to the point of, you know, Handmaid's Tale kind of level stories, you know, where you serious oppression, which some people see might actually be coming, you know, but also in a very positive sense. So I guess let me go from the bottom up at this point. Now, Meg, how do you see the evolution of mirrored in fiction of where the queer community might be going?
My favorite thing that I've seen throughout 35 years as a reader is that queerness has become fully incidental to most of the stories that I read, that it's not, that it's almost never the focus of why a person is in a particular situation. Why is this queer person on a spaceship? Why is this queer person a time traveler? It's usually more focused on who is this person, and they just happen to be queer. And I think that that has happened in a way that mirrors the existence of queer people, at least in this country, gone from an unstoppable scandal that will ruin your life to something to raise an eyebrow at, to it just is, like your postman's gay, it just is. And I remember the first couple of times that I encountered, especially cheerfully incidental bisexual protagonists, and it wasn't a way to make a point about their morality or their structure as a person. It was just by the way, and it made them easily 40 times as interesting to me as they would have been if they were straight. But it was a relief to see it just casually dropped, not even into exposition, but into dialogue. So I think that as queerness becomes more incidental in our lives, it becomes more incidental in fiction. And I am old enough, forgive me, but I am old enough to still see that as both novel and freeing.
Yeah, Kathy.
I think that in this case, speculative fiction is not actually that unique from other types of fiction, in that I think one of the issues that we are working out slowly and getting there is that we need to, in order to see what a queer future looks like, fiction also needs to show us a more complete vision of what a queer experience looks like. And so thankfully we are past the day where literally every queer person has to die at the end of the book, or almost every queer person or whatever. So, you know, we're getting to the point now where that's not a given. And so we can have interesting things where, you know, I've read quite a few books where there's a lot of queer joy in the book. And I think that's a necessary component of the future, even if we have an apocalypse. But what's interesting is because it's not a given that all queer characters must die, we also see interesting books like, oh my gosh, why didn't I write it down? I think it's Adam Silvera's book. It's a book in which everyone finds out, basically the day that you die, you get a phone call in the morning that you're going to die. And I can't remember the title of the book off the top of my head. And I love this book because, yes, the gay characters die at the end, which is not really a spoiler. They get a phone call in the very first few seconds of the book. But despite the fact that they die at the end, because it's not a given in all stories that dying at the end is what happens to all gay people, I feel like that book is, rather than being tragic queers, it's a book about queer tragedy. And I feel like you can more, and it also has quite a bit of queer joy in it, despite the fact that everyone's going to die. But I mean, that's life. But I feel like when we have this full experience, we're able to more deeply explore things like a tragedy with queer characters, where the fact that it's a tragedy has nothing to do with the fact that they're queer and everything to do with the fact that you get a phone call when you're going to die. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like that is not just in speculative fiction, but I feel like speculative fiction embracing that is helping us to tell more stories about queer communities in the future. Because when you have a full experience of life to draw on in fiction without it being hampered too much by tropes, you can more easily talk about a future community.
Okay, and an alert audience member has said that they both die at the end.
Yes, so
is that book?
Yes, so not a spoiler, it's actually in the title. So.
Right, exactly. Right. So Sachi, how do you see the evolution of how we represent ourselves mirrored in fiction?
I've been thinking about this and thinking that how much the future depends on what other people are doing. Will we continue to be as accepted as we are now? Will we get more accepted than we are now? I have to cope with that, thinking of what will be happening in the future. There are plenty of good lesbian space operas, you might say, and some things that are beyond, beyond that category. And lesbians in space is a thing you can fool around with without worrying too much about how the overall culture then fits in with the one now. But I'm not sure about. I've thought of how what benefits queer people might have in dystopian situations, and I can think about it, but I'm not going to go into that whole thing now because it goes too much with about breeders and so forth. But I think you can't count on universal acceptance between between alien cultures even in the future. So you can play with it. I've thought about there's back when I was young, there were women's land places where women will go and farm and no men. It doesn't even matter whether they're lesbians or not, just no men. I don't think there's that much of that around now. But I saw a thing recently that I think I'd like to put into a story in the future, but this is actually in the present. There's a place called the Tenacious Unicorn Ranch in Colorado, which was started by and includes totally trans, I believe it's trans women because they're all referred to as female. They're doing a wonderful job raising alpacas, but they're having to carry guns around because of the surrounding culture. It was very accepting for a while because they were doing very good things for it. They started recycling things, people liked it. But when people really figured out who they were, no, not so much. But that kind of thing in the future, I was thinking of lesbian farming or mining of, say, asteroids. and traveling spaceships with what we might call queer bars, and sneaking away from your asteroid to sample the bright lights of the biggest moon around when the ship comes through, or because there's a standard one there. Little things like that that you can be a little bit flippant, or just, you know, not try to go too far into what everybody in the universe thinks about this. In fact, I'd like to see, I think I'd like to think of a world where everyone was more or less bisexual or non-binary, and it just doesn't make any difference. But it does make it kind of complicated to write about them. But that is intriguing me. I'm not saying that's the best thing to do. I'm just saying that that kind of thing is what's percolating in my mind. We don't know. We don't know if there's going to be any Earth, you know, within several decades, you know, or at least a civilization will be the same in that length of time. And we don't know if we'll ever get out into space and meet different people and mine asteroids and so forth. There's a lot to work with there. And what you work with there can, in fact, influence or at least be a philosophical undertone on how things should be. That's about as far as I've got with that. But Catherine Lundoff writes some good, far distant, action-filled lesbian space stuff. And I know several others do, but I hadn't read all of them. But I'm confused enough and concerned enough about our future, the whole human race future right now, that it's hard to think of what might apply. Farming in Greenland, are we going to get our corner of it, or is it only going to be people that will breed this kind of thing? I'm not totally up spirited about this kind of thing, but I'm interested in it, and that's about it.
Okay, Chip, how do we reflect?
Yeah, well, one of the things I was thinking of listening to that, there are, you know, the human experience covers a whole lot of things. It covers childhood and birth. It covers, you know, death and work, you know, and somehow all of these have to be integrated, and the way these things, you know, impinge on us is going to be, simply because of our biology, is going to be different for the biological sexes, and then it's going to be, you know, and then it's going to, you know, and then when you sort of decide where you're comfortable, and you go through the confusion of you know, deciding which one you want to stay with or be with or have been with all along, and or however you see that, all of this has to be integrated, and it's a pretty complicated field in which you've got to, you know, you've got to deal. I always have been comforted. I am an old-fashioned Freudian, which sometimes is popular and sometimes is not so popular. But nevertheless, I mean, which starts out, you know, and Freud starts out with, we all start out as polymorphous perverse. And then various experiences push us in one way or the other, in one direction or another. I have some very clear memories of some of the early things that pushed me in the direction that I went. I seem to be as cisgender as you can possibly be, but I'm, and I remember starting out pretty polymorphous perverse myself, but I also remember situations as far back as I was being 6, and then again in 8 and 10 and 12, you know, that pushed me definitely in one direction or the other. And the availability is not to be sneezed at, which has a lot to do with what you find yourself, at least trying out. Now, whether you're comfortable with it and whether you want to stay there is a whole new set of questions. And so I don't know, all of this has got to work into it somehow. And I don't, and how it works into your stories and how it works into your life and how the life reflects the stories, it just becomes infinitely confused as soon as you get in front of a page and try to reflect from the inside onto a page in words what came to you through all five senses and what have you on your, in language, with outside of language when you were experiencing it. I don't think it's a soluble situation. It's a situation in which you hunt and peck and try and find things, which is what I assume we are all doing, more or less. I don't know. I'm always, Keffy, you say, well, unattractive. I think you're very attractive. That's just my initial response, seeing you. I don't think we'll ever do anything about it because of my age and the difference of where we are. But nevertheless, I think it's Kinsey who says the reality of sex is different, is much more complicated than anyone imagines and anyone can imagine. That's the field that you got to work in. You've got to imagine things that can't be imagined if you're going to come up with something meaningful on this, or something reasonable, and that's why it is so interesting, and also why it is so difficult.
Okay, we have a number of great questions, which we're not going to have time to get to, and because we're coming up to I think the last 8 minutes of the panel before we have to start, the questions kind of cover, they sort of are similar, and so I'm going to put out two different things, and people can make their wrap-up comments, and you can address whatever you wish from these. One of them is, we've had a number of questions addressing the difference between the generations and the difference between what the younger generations are seeing coming up in terms of queer identity, queer self-identity, and the normalization of it, or how they view it as being part of society. All that has changed drastically in just the last 10 years. So how did the two generations, the old school queer people and the new folks coming up, what is relevant from the old school for them, and how do we integrate their view of the future? The other one is a question, has come up, a couple of the audience questions relate to something I wanted to ask. Can queer people be mainstreamed in the sense of just totally accepted as a mainstream part of society and still have a distinctive community? Does distinctive community depend on not being mainstreamed, or is it possible to have the best of both worlds? Excuse me. Someone said, what's the difference between normalization, integration, and assimilation? Okay, so I think I'll start in the middle here. Sachi, you want to do your, I think, final 2 minutes, I think you got.
I think every generation would rather not take on whole scale the previous generations, anything really, ideas, and I think that's becoming even more so. But I think it also depends on where you live. There's still vast areas of this country where young people have to hide their identities or be thrown out, or just waiting desperately to be able to get out to the big cities elsewhere. We're not at a point where we can count on everyone being either assimilated or respected or whatever. I think we're getting that way, and the young people that are able to are wanting to form their own ideas, and as identifying, not squeezing themselves into the old, lesbian, gay, even trans identities, but thinking of their own identities. We keep getting more and more terms tacked onto the LGBTQ plus, et cetera, and that's good. They have to work in the current world. I have a 15-year-old granddaughter. I don't know what direction she's going to go. She's a great kid, but I know that there's no point in trying to confine them into any, I would say old ideas, but the old ideas varied as they went along too. But I'm glad to see it. That's about it.
Okay, Meg.
I think that it is possible to be part of mainstream society and also to exist in disparate community. And I think that if we examine our lives along the different axes of identity, we'll see that we're already doing that. Being a member of an even very radical queer community doesn't keep most of us from going to work and going to the grocery store and being a part of our larger neighborhoods. I think that assimilation is a poor goal for any group or any individual person. We don't have to give up any part of who we are or pretend that any part of who we are is smoother or less important than it is in order to take part. I think that as much as we struggle with nuance as a species, we are learning slowly, painfully, to relate to one another better as rough and strange, as rich and strange, and that as that project moves on, that queer people will become incidental, which I guess is the word of the day for me.
Okay, Chip.
I think the age problem for me is entirely a technological problem. It's which is to say, I have a 30-year-old, very nice, very technically competent assistant, without which I would not be here today. I mean, both literally, I wouldn't be Readercon because he set everything up so that I just had to push a few buttons. And I couldn't function without him. So I mean, that's the main thing. I don't think of myself. One of the things I was trying to explain to someone fairly recently is at 80, which is basically I'm a few months from being 80 years old. I just don't think of myself as having a future. I think of I listen to Saatchi saying, which I know intellectually is true, that and people just in an email from a friend of mine in Vancouver, a young Noel Sturgeon, a couple of days ago, she was talking about, she ended the email that, but I do live every day in dread, and basically about the heat death problems that are, the not heat death, of the climate change problems that we are, that we hear about it, and are my major concern for the planet. But I am 80 years old, and I lost a cousin who was 81 a couple of weeks ago, who was very much like, as close to me as a brother could possibly be, and we hadn't seen each other for a long time. He was straight, but we used to be as close as brothers. Didn't see each other for a long time. Found each other, and then we exchanged 2 long emails, and he died, sort of like that, and was very. Wasn't sad so much. We hadn't gotten real close again, just 2 long emails. But again, but I don't think of anything in my life now as having a personal future. My family is very long lived. You know, the women live to, 103, 106. The men, get to their middle 90s. I may make it for another 15 years, but but I may not. I may die like Edward, in a couple of weeks. And I don't, do I dwell on it? No. I still do lots and lots of Facebook posts, and I'm very happy doing Facebook posts, which is what I think of as what I do.
Well, maybe you could look at it as a legacy rather than as a personal future. I think we want to give Kefi.
I think it's me personally.
Yeah.
If I have a legacy, I left it. It's there. I showed it to you. I held up the books that I've self-published.
Right.
That's it. And a few more that published all during my life back to
Right.
But I keep telling people that I think the most interesting thing I did science fictionally is invent a new form of birth control that I wish nobody ever talks about. and I used it in 2 books and nobody seems to notice it. I used it in Triton, and then I used it again in Through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders, which is a much closer book, but I think it's a necessary thing, and that's a birth control, which basically at puberty they give you a shot, which turns off the whole reproduction mechanism for both men and women. And then if you decide you want to have a child, at a certain point, 2 people get together, whatever their sex, and they agree, and they get another shot that turns it on temporarily. And they work at that. And what it does, it's just in terms of information theory, it turns reproduction from a systems on system in which accidents mitigates for having a child to a systems off system in which accident mitigates against having a child. And I think and it makes it as something that everybody has to agree on. And I think this would do a tremendous amount to change to change the future of the world. But nobody notices it when they read the novels, and nobody talks about it when the novels, when they talk about what Delaney has done. So maybe 3 people who hear this will think, oh, next time take a look at that, I'll see if I can find it. But that's again, I think. You can't control the reader's attention, and what controls the reader's attention is what the reader has been going through, and that is the reader. If the reader is a 15-year-old who's been programming since they were 3 and a half or 5 as my assistant today, my 30-year-old assistant, that's his life experience, and so he can do lots of things that I built a computer when I was 15 and got a prize in the science fair, and I can't program anything.
Okay, we are actually over time at this
okay,
point. I'm getting all kinds of scary warnings, and we do need to open this channel up for the next panel. So unfortunately, I'm going to thank all of our panelists very much for all of your generous contributions, and there's been a very lively conversation in the Discord channel which is going to move to Hallway Chat 2 in the Discord channel now. If you want to continue these discussions, just about all the books you've mentioned have actually been put in there. So again, thank you, audience, and thank you, all you panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.